No one expected the flagship Horizon's call to be saved by a dog, especially not Commander Voss, who'd spent 3 years enforcing every protocol in the book, including the one that said animals belonged in cargo, not on the bridge. But when the ship's alarm screamed and the intruders materialized in her command center, it wasn't her tactical officer or her armed security team that exposed the saboteurs. It was Rover, a scarred mutt from the ruins of Detroit, who'd been smuggled aboard in a duffel bag 2 weeks prior. The question wasn't whether Rover belonged on the bridge, it was whether anyone else did. Rover had been a mistake from the start. Not his existence, though the half-starved terrier mix with one crooked ear and a limp had certainly lived through enough disasters to earn that title, but his presence on the Horizon's call. Lieutenant Miko Tanaka, a junior engineer with a soft heart and a history of bending rules, had found him in the rubble of a collapsed food depot during shore leave on Earth. The depot had been hit by shelling during the Coalition's latest skirmish with insurgents, and Rover had been guarding a dead woman's body when Miko stumbled over him in the dark. "Come on, buddy," Miko had whispered, crouching low. "She's gone. You don't have to stay." Rover had growled, a low rumble that said he knew exactly what Miko was offering and didn't trust it. But when Miko pulled a protein bar from her pocket and tore it in half, Rover's resolve cracked. He ate the bar in 3 bites, licked Miko's fingers, and followed her back to the transport shuttle without a sound. Smuggling him aboard had been easier than expected. Miko tucked him into a cargo duffel, bribed a cargo tech with a bottle of whiskey, and walked Rover straight past security. Once in her quarters, she set up a makeshift bed in the corner and swore him to silence. Rover, who'd survived 2 years in a war zone, understood the assignment. He stayed quiet during inspections, slept under Miko's bunk, and only ventured into the corridors when the third shift was on duty and the lights were dimmed. For 2 weeks, Rover was a ghost. He learned the rhythms of the ship, the hum of the engines at 400, the clatter of meal trays in the mess at 700, the low murmur of voices on the bridge during third shift. He learned which crew members carried food in their pockets, and which ones smelled like soap or sweat or fear. He learned that the ship's ventilation system carried scents from every deck, and he memorized them all. Engine grease, recycled air, the faint tang of antiseptic from the med bay, the sweet-sour smell of the hydroponics bay where Miko sometimes snuck him for exercise. But Rover's secret couldn't last forever. On the morning of day 15, he made his first mistake. It started in the mess hall. Miko had been called to the engine room for an emergency coolant leak, and she'd left Rover locked in her quarters with a bowl of kibble and a chew toy. Rover had been content for about an hour. Then he'd heard the sound, a low metallic scrape coming from the ventilation duct above his head. It wasn't the usual hum of air circulation. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Wrong. Rover's ears pricked. He stood on his hind legs, sniffing at the vent cover. The scent was faint but distinct, chemical residue, human sweat, and something else, something sharp and acrid that made his lip curl. He barked once, a short warning, and scratched at the vent. The sound stopped. Rover waited, ears forward, body tense. When the sound didn't resume, Rover made a decision. He nosed open the door, Miko had forgotten to lock it properly, and padded into the corridor. The scent trail led him through the crew quarters, past the rec room, and up 2 decks toward the bridge. Rover followed it with single-minded focus, his limp barely noticeable as he trotted along the metal floors. He didn't notice the startled ensign who pressed herself against the wall as he passed, or the security officer who reached for his comm link and hesitated, unsure whether to report a dog or assume he was hallucinating. Rover reached the bridge access corridor just as Commander Voss was stepping out of the ready room, a datapad in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She froze mid-step when she saw him. Rover froze too, his tail low, his eyes locked on hers. "What the hell," Voss said slowly, "is that?" Before anyone could answer, Rover barked, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed off the walls. Then he turned and bolted back down the corridor, pausing at the corner to look back at her. Voss stared after him, her mind racing. Dogs didn't belong on starships. Dogs didn't materialize out of thin air. And dogs definitely didn't run onto the bridge barking like they'd just discovered a bomb. "Security," Voss said into her comm, her voice clipped. "I need a team on Deck 3, Corridor 6. We have an unauthorized animal on board, and someone find out whose quarters he came from." But Rover was already gone, his claws clicking against the floor as he disappeared into the shadows. By the time security tracked Rover back to Miko's quarters, half the crew had heard about the bridge dog. Rumors spread fast on a ship with 1,500 people and limited entertainment. Some said he was a stray that had wandered in during a cargo transfer. Others claimed he was a genetically engineered scout animal left over from the war. A few insisted he was a good luck charm, and anyone who kicked him off the ship would doom them all. Miko, for her part, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor when Voss summoned her to the ready room. She stood at attention in front of the commander's desk, her hands clasped behind her back, her face pale. Rover sat at her feet, his tail tucked, his eyes flicking between Miko and Voss as if he understood exactly how much trouble he'd caused. "Lieutenant Tanaka," Voss began, her voice dangerously calm, "do you have any idea how many regulations you've violated by bringing an animal aboard this ship?" "Yes, ma'am," Miko said quietly. "7 if you count the health and safety codes." "Try 12, Voss said, tapping her datapad. "And that's not including the potential biohazard risk. We don't know where this animal has been or what he's carrying. For all we know, he could have parasites, diseases, or worse." "He's been vaccinated," Miko said quickly. "I took him to a vet on Earth before we left. He's clean. I have the records." Voss raised an eyebrow. "You planned this?" "Not exactly," Miko admitted. He didn't have anywhere else to go, and he's been through hell, ma'am. I couldn't leave him." Voss leaned back in her chair, studying Rover. The dog stared back at her, his one good ear twitching, his brown eyes steady and unblinking. There was something unsettling about that gaze, something sharp and aware that didn't match the scruffy, half-starved appearance. Voss had seen a lot of soldiers in her 20 years in the Coalition Navy, and Rover had the same look, the quiet readiness of someone who'd survived things they shouldn't have. "He's trained," Voss said finally, "isn't he?" "I think so," Miko said. "He follows commands, stays quiet, doesn't make a mess. He's a good dog, ma'am." "That's not the point," Voss said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "The point is that this ship has rules for a reason. Animals are a liability. They're unpredictable. They can't follow protocol. And if something goes wrong—" She stopped mid-sentence as Rover stood and padded over to her desk. He sat down in front of her, raised one paw and held it there, waiting. Voss stared at him. Then, against her better judgment, she reached out and shook the paw. Rover's tail wagged once, a single deliberate thump against the floor. "Lieutenant," Voss said slowly, "get this dog out of my ready room, and keep him in your quarters. If I see him on the bridge again—" "You won't, ma'am," Miko said quickly. "I promise." But even as she said it, both of them knew it was a lie. Rover had already proven he could get anywhere he wanted, and neither of them had any idea why he'd been so desperate to reach the bridge. The answer came 3 days later. It started with a power fluctuation in the starboard engine. Nothing major, just a brief dip in output that the engineers flagged and dismissed as a minor glitch. But Rover, who'd been napping in Miko's quarters, woke up the moment it happened. He lifted his head, ears forward, and sniffed the air. The scent was back, the same sharp, acrid smell he'd noticed in the ventilation shaft. Only this time it was stronger, closer. Rover stood, his body tense, and nosed open the door again. Miko had tried locking it 3 different ways, but Rover had figured out every mechanism within hours. He slipped into the corridor and followed the scent trail, his limp more pronounced now as he climbed the stairs to Deck 2. The trail led him past the hydroponics bay, through a maintenance tunnel, and into a section of the ship he'd never explored before, the secondary bridge access corridor. The corridor was empty, the lights dimmed for night cycle. Rover moved slowly, his nose to the ground, his ears swiveling. The scent was coming from behind a wall panel near the access door. Rover pawed at the panel, whining softly. Then he heard it, a faint hiss like air escaping through a valve. The panel shifted just a fraction of an inch. Rover barked, a sharp warning, and the hissing stopped. When security found him 10 minutes later, Rover was sitting in front of the panel, his ears flat, his teeth bared. The guards assumed he'd chewed through the wiring, until they pried the panel open and found the device tucked inside. A compact explosive charge rigged to the bridge's main power conduit. The charge was set to detonate in 6 hours, right at the start of the next shift change. Rover had just saved the ship. The discovery of the explosive triggered a ship-wide lockdown. Voss ordered every crew member confined to quarters while security swept the decks for additional devices. The engineers disabled the charge and sent it to the lab for analysis, and within an hour, they had their answer. The explosive was Korvathi tech, compact and nearly undetectable by standard scanners. It had been planted by someone with intimate knowledge of the ship's systems, someone who knew exactly where to hide it and how long it would take to find. "We have a saboteur," Voss said grimly, standing in the center of the bridge. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Jace Harlan, pulled up a schematic of the ship on the main screen. Red dots marked the locations of known access points where the device could have been planted. There were 23 of them, scattered across 5 decks. "How long have they been on board?" Harlan asked. "Unknown," Voss said. "But if they planted that charge, they're still here, and they're not working alone. The Korvathi don't operate solo. They work in cells, 3 to 5 operatives embedded for weeks or months before they strike." Harlan's jaw tightened. "We need to sweep the crew. Run biometric scans, check every ID badge, isolate anyone who doesn't match their records." "That'll take hours," Voss said. "And if they know we're looking, they'll accelerate their timeline. We need to find them now." As if on cue, Rover appeared in the doorway of the bridge, his ears pricked, his tail low. Miko was right behind him, breathless and apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, he got out again. I didn't—" "It's fine," Voss said, cutting her off. She studied Rover, who was sniffing the air with single-minded intensity. "Tanaka, does he do that often, the sniffing?" "All the time," Miko said. "He's got a crazy sense of smell. He can find food from 3 decks away. And she hesitated. He doesn't like certain people. I've noticed it. If someone smells wrong, he growls or backs away. I thought it was just, dog instinct." Voss and Harlan exchanged a glance. "What if it's not just instinct?" Voss said slowly. "What if he's smelling something we can't?" Korvathi operatives use chemical suppressants to mask their biosignatures, but a dog wouldn't care about that. He'd smell the chemicals themselves. Harlan's eyes widened. "You want to use the dog as a sniffer?" "I want to see if he can find them," Voss said. She crouched down in front of Rover, her voice calm but firm. "All right, boy, you found one bomb. Can you find the people who planted it?" Rover tilted his head, his one good ear twitching. Then he turned and trotted toward the main corridor, his nose to the ground. Miko and Voss followed, with Harlan and 2 armed security officers close behind. Rover moved with purpose, pausing at intersections to sniff the air, then changing direction and continuing. He led them down 3 decks, through the crew quarters and into the cargo bay. The bay was massive, lined with storage containers and crates stacked 3 high. Rover stopped at the far end, near a cluster of unmarked crates. He sat down, his body tense, and growled, a low, rumbling sound that raised the hair on Miko's arms. "Open it," Voss said, gesturing to the nearest crate. One of the security officers pried the lid off with a crowbar. Inside, nestled among packing foam, were 3 more explosive charges, each one identical to the device Rover had found. And beneath them, wrapped in foil, were sealed containers of chemical suppressants, enough to mask the biosignatures of a dozen operatives. "They're not just saboteurs," Harlan said quietly. "They're preparing for a full assault." Voss's comm crackled. "Commander, we've got movement on Deck 5. 3 unknown signatures just appeared on the scanner. They're headed toward the engine room." Voss grabbed her sidearm. "Harlan, take your team and cut them off. Tanaka, get the dog back to your quarters and lock the door. This time, weld it shut if you have to." But Rover had other ideas. As the team sprinted toward the engine room, Rover broke free from Miko's grip and bolted after them, his limp forgotten, his legs pumping. Miko shouted his name, but he was already gone, disappearing into the maze of corridors. When the team reached the engine room, the saboteurs were already inside. The door was locked from the inside, the control panel sparking from a forced override. Harlan's team set up a breach charge, but before they could detonate it, the door slid open, and Rover burst through, his teeth bared, his body a blur of fur and fury. He launched himself at the nearest saboteur, a tall man in a maintenance uniform, and clamped his jaws around the man's wrist. The man screamed and fell, dropping a plasma cutter that clattered across the floor. The other 2 saboteurs spun toward Rover, weapons raised, but Harlan's team was faster. 2 shots rang out and both operatives went down. Rover released the first man's wrist and stood over him, growling, his body blocking the exit. The man didn't move. He stared at the dog with wide, disbelieving eyes, his hand pressed to his bleeding wrist. "Good boy," Voss said quietly, stepping into the room. She looked at Rover, then at the man on the floor. "You just saved this ship, again." Rover wagged his tail once, then sat down, panting. The aftermath of the sabotage attempt was swift and thorough. The 3 captured operatives were detained in the brig, their chemical suppressants confiscated and analyzed. The engineering team swept the ship for additional devices and found 2 more charges, both hidden in critical systems. By the time the Horizon's call reached its next port, the crew had a new story to tell and a new hero to celebrate. Rover became an overnight legend. Crew members stopped Miko in the corridors to ask about him, to slip him treats, to scratch his ears and take photos. Someone printed a makeshift ID badge with his picture and the title Honorary Security Officer. Someone else started a petition to make him the ship's official mascot. Even Voss, who'd spent 3 years enforcing regulations with an iron fist, found herself bending the rules she'd once defended. "He's earned it," she said to Harlan one evening, standing on the bridge and watching Rover curl up on a mat someone had placed in the corner. "I don't care what the regulations say, he stays." Harlan smiled. "I'll draft the paperwork. Though I'm not sure how we're going to classify him. Working animal doesn't quite cover it. Call him a security asset," Voss said, "or a morale officer. Hell, call him whatever you want. Just make it official." The paperwork went through faster than anyone expected. Within a week, Rover had his own ID badge, his own rations, and his own designated spot on the bridge, a padded mat near Voss's command chair. He took to his new role with the same quiet competence he'd shown since the day Miko smuggled him aboard. He slept during quiet shifts, watched the crew during busy ones, and occasionally padded over to Voss's chair to rest his chin on her knee. She never pushed him away. Miko visited him every day, bringing him treats and toys and stories about the engine room. She'd sit on the floor next to his mat, scratching his ears and whispering apologies for all the trouble he'd caused. Rover would lick her hand and wag his tail, as if to say it was all worth it. But Rover's work wasn't done. 3 months after the sabotage attempt, the Horizon's call was escorting a supply convoy through contested space when the sensors picked up an unidentified signal. It was faint, barely a blip on the scanner, but Voss ordered the ship to yellow alert just in case. Rover, who'd been napping on his mat, stood and walked to the edge of the bridge, his ears forward, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Voss asked, watching him. Rover didn't answer. He just stared at the main screen, his tail low, his posture rigid. The signal grew stronger. Then the ship shuddered as something hit the shields, a glancing blow that sent sparks flying from a nearby console. Voss grabbed the arms of her chair. "Harlan, report." "Hostile contact," Harlan said, his fingers flying over his console. "4 ships, Korvathi design. They're jamming our comms and charging weapons." "Evasive maneuvers," Voss ordered. "Get us out of here." But Rover was already moving. He bolted off the bridge, his claws skidding on the metal floor, and disappeared down the corridor. Miko, who'd been standing near the engineering station, ran after him. "Rover, wait!" She caught up with him 2 decks down, near the secondary airlock. Rover was pacing back and forth in front of the door, growling low in his throat. Miko knelt beside him, her hand on his back. "What's wrong?" Then she smelled it, the same sharp, acrid scent Rover had tracked before. The chemical suppressants. Her blood went cold. She grabbed her comm. "Commander, we've got a problem. Deck 7, secondary airlock. I think there's another saboteur." Voss's voice crackled through. "On our way, don't engage." But Rover had already made his choice. He barked once, sharp and commanding, then threw himself at the airlock door. It didn't budge. He barked again, louder this time, and scratched at the control panel. Miko hesitated, then hit the override. The door slid open. Inside, crouched next to a bundle of wiring, was a woman in a maintenance uniform. She looked up, her eyes wide with panic, and reached for a weapon. Rover didn't give her the chance. He lunged, his teeth sinking into her sleeve, and dragged her away from the wiring. The woman screamed and tried to shake him off, but Rover held on, his growl filling the small space. Miko grabbed the woman's weapon and kicked it away, then hit the emergency alarm. Security arrived seconds later, followed by Voss and Harlan. They found Rover standing over the woman, his body blocking her escape, his teeth still bared. The bundle of wiring turned out to be another explosive charge, rigged to blow a hole in the hull and depressurize half the ship. "Good boy," Voss said again, her voice quiet and full of something that might have been pride. She looked at Miko. "Looks like he's not just a bridge dog anymore. He's our best defense." Rover wagged his tail once, then sat down, panting. 6 months after Rover first snuck onto the Horizon's call, the ship returned to Earth for resupply. Miko stood on the observation deck, watching the blue-green curve of the planet grow larger on the screen. Rover sat beside her, his head resting on her knee, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "You could stay here, you know," Miko said quietly. "Find a home planetside, maybe a family. You've earned it." Rover looked up at her, his brown eyes steady and calm. Then he stood, walked to the door, and barked once, a short, decisive sound that said everything he needed to say. This was his home, the ship, the crew, the bridge, and he wasn't going anywhere. Miko smiled. "All right, boy, let's get back to work." When the Horizon's call launched again 3 days later, Rover was on the bridge, his mat freshly washed, his ID badge gleaming on his collar. Voss looked down at him from her command chair and shook her head, smiling. "They said no pets on the bridge. Guess we proved them wrong." Rover wagged his tail and rested his chin on his paws. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched endlessly, and the ship hummed with life. Somewhere in the ruins of Detroit, a woman's body had been buried with honors, and a half-starved dog had been given a second chance. Now that dog was a hero, a member of the crew, a guardian of the bridge, and a reminder that sometimes the best soldiers are the ones no one expects. The ship jumped to lightspeed, and Rover closed his eyes, content.